This is Dr. Jessica Han. We're continuing with Chapter 16, Endocrine System. The last module in this chapter is hormone chemistry. All the hormones secreted from the glands can be classified into three categories based on their chemical structures: steroids, monoamines, peptides, and glycoproteins. Steroids derived from the cholesterol molecule. Examples are sex steroids from gonads and corticosteroids from adrenal glands. Monoamines are made from amino acids. In this category, dopamine, epinephrine, norepinephrine, melatonin, thyroid hormones are all derived from amino acid structures. Peptide and glycoproteins, those hormones are created from the chains of amino acid. Glycoproteins are the proteins plus the structure of carbohydrate. Insulin is an example of large peptide hormone. The hormone secretion varies. They are not secreted at steady rates. Some hormones are secreted on a daily basis, such as melatonin, which controls the circadian rhythm. Some hormones are secreted on a monthly rhythm, such as FSH and LH, those hormones controlling women's ovarian cycle. Other hormones secreted under the influence of stimuli that signify a need for them. Those stimulus include neural stimuli, hormonal stimuli, or humoral stimuli. Neural stimuli are nerve fibers supply some endocrine glands and stimulate the release of their hormones. Hormonal stimuli refer to hormones from the hypothalamus, regulate secretion of the hormones from the anterior pituitary gland. Then pituitary hormones stimulate other endocrine glands to release hormones such as thyroid hormone from the thyroid gland, sex hormones from the gonads, and the cortisol. Humoral stimuli refers to the blood-bone stimuli. The rising of blood glucose, for example, can stimulate the release of insulin. The lower blood osmolarity will stimulate the secretion of aldosterone to increase the water retention and increase the water volume. Low blood calcium level will stimulate the secretion of parathyroid hormone to increase the blood calcium level by increasing the bone resorption and small intestine absorption of calcium. Peptide hormones and monoamine hormones are stored in secretory vessels of the endocrine cell until they are needed. Steroid hormones are not being stored in any type of vessels. They are released as fast as they are synthesized by diffusion through the cell surface. The reasons are that most monoamine and peptide hormones are hydrophilic, which means they can be dissolved in the water, so they can easily mix with blood plasma. Steroids and thyroid hormone are hydrophobic, which means they can diffuse through the phospholipid bilayer cell membrane and bind to the receptors intracellularly. The monoamine and peptide hormones, since they are hydrophilic, they cannot penetrate the cell. They have to bind to the receptor on the surface of the cell membrane and cause a cascade of secondary messengers to pass the signal into the cell. The receptors accepting hormones are proteins or glycoprotein molecules. They are located at either plasma membrane or cytoplasm or even in the nucleus. Receptors act like switches to turn on the metabolic pathways when hormone binds to them. Usually, all the target cells will have a few thousand receptors for a given hormone. The receptors have some characteristics. First, they are specific. The receptor only recognizes its specific hormone and bind to it. Secondly, the receptor can be saturated. Since the number of the receptors are certain, there are only certain molecules of hormone can bind to the receptor. Once the receptors are being saturated, then there's no more hormones can bind to them. Then the metabolic reaction will not be enhanced further. As we mentioned earlier, peptide hormones and monoamine hormones cannot penetrate target cell since they are hydrophilic, they will bind to the surface receptors and activate intracellular processes through second messengers. Steroid hormone can penetrate the plasma membrane since they are hydrophobic, so therefore they can bind to internal receptors, which are usually located within the nucleus. The steroid hormones can often influence the expression of genes of target cells. Since the impact is at the gene level, it's going to take several hours or days to show effect due to a lag for protein synthesis from the gene. This slide demonstrates the binding of hormonal receptors. A shows the peptide hormone will bind to the surface receptor and activate a cascade of second messengers to stimulate the cell reaction. B shows the steroid hormone can diffuse across the cell membrane and directly go to the cell nucleus, bind to the receptor on the nucleus to turn on the gene transcription and further protein synthesis. Then the newly synthesized protein will affect various metabolic effects. The examples are showing here. Estrogen is a steroid hormone. It will directly bind the nuclear receptors to control the activity of progesterone and synthesize a series of enzymes to regulate the uterus and the ovarian activities. Thyroid hormone is a hydrophilic hormone. It will bind to the protein and turn on a cascade of ATP-dependent proteins to control the T cell maturation and activities. The signal produced from the binding of receptor and hormones can be amplified through the second messenger cascade. The target cell sensitivity can be adjusted by changing the number of receptors. They can also be upregulated by increase the number of the receptors. They can be downregulated by reduce the number of the receptors. Therefore, the cell will be less sensitive. Therefore, modulate the receptor activity and the number of the receptor being saturated can control the cell sensitivity. Many hormones can act together to produce a synergistic effects. Then one hormone sometimes can enhance the target organ's response to a second later hormone. This is called the permissive effects. For example, estrogen can prepare uterus for action of progesterone. Some hormones will work opposed to each other. This interaction will be called antagonistic effect. For example, glucagon and insulin work opposed to each other to maintain the glucose homeostasis. When glucose level is high, insulin will be secreted to remove glucose from the bloodstream. While glucose level is low, glucagon will act on liver to break down more glycogen and release glucose back to the bloodstream. The hormones can be cleared or turned off after they have served their purpose. Most hormones are taken up and degraded by liver and the kidney, then being excreted either in bile or urine. The rate of hormone removal from the blood is called metabolic clearance rate. All the hormones have a half-life. Half-life means the time required to clear 50% of hormone from the blood. Some conditions, such as stress, can upset homeostasis and threatens one's physical or emotional health. Over a long time, if there is a consistent way the body reacts to stress, it will develop into a general adaptation syndrome, GAS. This syndrome will typically involve elevated levels of epinephrine and glucocorticoid, especially cortisol. This syndrome can occur in 3 stages. The first, there's alarm reaction. Second, there's a stage of resistance to hormone stimulation. The third, the body will show the stage of exhaustion. In the alarm reaction, the body shows the initial response to the stress situation. This initial response will be mediated by norepinephrine from the sympathetic nerve system and epinephrine from the adrenal medulla. These 2 hormones will prepare body for fight and flight. The stored glycogen will be consumed and turn into glucose. The increased aldosterone and angiotensin levels will go up. Angiotensin will help raise blood pressure. Aldosterone will promote sodium and water conservation. Later, the body will develop into the resistance stage. It will provide alternative fuels for metabolism. After a few hours, glycogen reserves gone, but brain still need glucose to do activities. Therefore, the body will be dominated by cortisol. The hypothalamus will release the CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone. Pituitary will release ACTH to stimulate the adrenal cortex to secrete cortisol and glucocorticoids to promote the breakdown of fat, protein into glycerol, fatty acids, amino acids for gluconeogenesis. Cortisol has glucose-sparing effect. It will inhibit protein synthesis, leaving free amino acids for gluconeogenesis. Adverse effect of excess cortisol is that it will depress the immune system, increases susceptibility to infection and ulcers. The lymph tissues will turn to atrophy and antibody levels will drop. If there is a wound on the body, the wound will heal poorly. When stress continues for several months, the fat reserves are gone. Homeostasis is overwhelmed. Protein breakdown, muscle wasting, loss of glucose homeostasis, exhaustion promotes water retention, and hypertension. Death results from heart and kidney failure or overwhelming infection. All these things could happen at the stage of the exhaustion due to prolonged effect of the stress. In addition to hormone neurotransmitter, there are some chemicals can function as a hormone. For example, paracrines. Those are chemical messengers that can diffuse short distances and stimulate nearby cells. For example, molecules like histamine, nitric oxide, catecholamines can affect different types of tissue. Histamine from the mast cells in the connective tissue can cause the relaxation of blood vessel. Nitric oxide from endothelium of the blood vessels can cause vasodilation. Catecholamine diffuse from adrenal medulla to cortex. Autocrine is a chemical messenger that stimulates the same cell that secreted them. Eicosanoids, important family of paracrines. They are derived from fatty acid called arachidonic acid. Lipoxygenase, this is the enzyme that can convert arachidonic acid into leukotrienes. Leukotrienes will mediate allergic and inflammatory reactions. There are anti-inflammatory drugs can be used to regulate the body metabolism just like the hormones. There are some anti-inflammatory drugs such as cortisol and corticosterone can promote breakdown of fat and protein. There are some steroid anti-inflammatory drugs can inhibit inflammation by blocking release of arachidonic acid from plasma membrane and inhibit synthesis of eicosanoids. There are aspirin, ibuprofen, and celecoxib. Those are non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. They can block enzyme activities and inhibit some molecule synthesis which cause body go into exhaustion and unhealthy condition. There are some endocrine disorders can occur due to either low secretion or high secretion of hormones. Hyposecretion is inadequate hormone release. It can cause trauma. They can cause autoimmune problems. Hypersecretion of the hormone can cause tumor and also autoimmune disorders. Hypersecretion of growth hormone will cause a disease. Acromegaly is a hypersecretion of growth hormone, which lead to thickening of bones and soft tissues in adults. You can compare the size of the hands in the patients who have this acromegaly to the normal size of the hand. Hypersecretion of growth hormone in childhood or adolescent before growth plates are depleted will cause gigantism if hypersecretion occurs. If it is a hyposecretion, pituitary dolphinism will occur. Parathyroid disorder will have a big neck. The goiter is a pathological enlargement of the thyroid gland, as shown in the picture. Hyposecretion of thyroid hormone will cause the congenital hypothyroidism. Hyposecretion of thyroid hormone present at birth. In the adult, the hypothyroidism is myxedema. Hypoparathyroidism is lack of the parathyroid hormone. Hyperparathyroidism is excess parathyroid hormone secretion. Adrenal disorders, including Cushing's syndrome, there is excess secretion of cortisol, which will lead to hyperglycemia, hypertension, weakness, edema, rapid muscle and bone loss due to protein catabolism, abdominal fat deposition. Adrenal genital syndrome, showing here, it's a hypersecretion of cortisol. It accompanies with Cushing. There will be enlargement of external sexual organs in children and the early onset of puberty. In women, there will be increased body hair, deeper voice, and beard growth. Disrupted secretion of insulin, lack of insulin, and the hyposecretion of insulin will cause diabetes. Type 1 diabetes, the insulin is deficient. In type 2 diabetes, the insulin is there, but target cells resist to respond to insulin. In summary, this module talk about the hormonal chemistry, classification, secretion, transport, and diseases related to abnormal hormonal secretion.